Okay, well, hey everybody. Nice to see so many familiar faces. Love seeing that. Folks that have been following, responding to the blog, been in classes, gotten to do projects together. Fun to see you all. Thanks for carving out a little bit of time in your Thursday morning or midday for those of you on the East Coast or abroad. And yeah, looking forward to our session together today. As you know, we do these webinars fairly often, right? Once every couple months. And usually they're kind of big picture, right? So it's something that's just very generally applicable, like how do parameters work? So we're excited to be able to do one that's a little bit more industry specific. Now, if you're not in education, that's still okay. The kind of principles that we're going to talk about as far as creating a custom calendar and then integrating that with the rest of your data, I think it's actually going to be applicable for a lot of industries. But you know, we've gotten some requests from folks in the education space, and we definitely do quite a bit of work there, both higher ed as well as K through 12. And so it's kind of like asking you shall receive, right? We did a date calculations webinar a few months ago, and there were a lot of questions specifically from the education world that we got as a result of that. So we want to take some time to dive into that today, go through a couple scenarios, talk about, hey, you know, here's how we'd approach this, here's how we'd approach that. And then we're going to make sure that we reserve some time to be able to answer questions as well, because you know everybody has a little bit of their own wrinkle, you know, based on what's going on with your organization. So let me go ahead and flip forward here, and we'll kind of finish up the introduction, and we'll get rolling. So my name is Eric. I have gotten to know a lot of you before, so thanks for coming back for if you've been to different trainings and events. I spend my time doing a variety of different activities, primarily teaching classes, and that includes Tableau Desktop and Tableau Prep mostly, as well as a couple other tools. And then I spend about half my time working on projects as well. And you probably have also seen that I write some blogs and do some videos and do these webinars. It's kind of a way for me to stay sharp and be able to hopefully help provide value to others as well. And just kind of a shout out here to get things kicked off to Dan Wilson at Temple University, who's here on the call. Thanks for being here, Dan. He's been very helpful to me answering a lot of questions that I've had along the way while designing the content for this webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and share kind of what the agenda looks like. And then, like I said, we are going to have plenty of time for questions at the end. You're also welcome to ask questions throughout the webinar. My colleague Kirk is going to help me be my second set of eyes, because it's kind of hard to get in the sharing mindset and then also doing a good job of actively monitoring the chat. But if you do have questions along the way, you're welcome to ask those. Kirk might stop me, or I might end up kind of circling back to them at the end of our session. And then we are recording this as well. So at least the screen will be recorded. I don't think my video will, but I think you'll live. So if there is anything that you would like to come back to, later on or revisit or try on your own, then we'll have a recording out here in the next couple days. All right. So our agenda and what we're going to look at, we're actually going to kind of have two halves of our session. So in the first half, we are going to focus specifically on academic calendar, like the title says, right? So breaking your year down into things like semesters or quarters, or whatever your unique periods look like. And then we're actually going to talk about fiscal calendars as well. These two topics are just so interrelated. It was hard to just say, well, we'll talk about academic, but definitely not fiscal, right? So when we talk about a fiscal calendar, a lot of times we're talking about like, hey, my fiscal year starts July 1st, ends June 30th. Maybe I need to do some sort of comparisons across different fiscal years, and I want that to integrate nicely with my data. Let me go ahead and get underway. So like I said, we're going to start by talking about an academic calendar. So before I actually show you an academic calendar that I've built outside of Tableau, I want to start by looking at some data that you might want to use an academic calendar with. And so in this case, I'm going to be working with a data set that has enrollment level data. So each line in this screenshot that you can see here represents, you can see sometimes a student might register multiple times, right? But these would represent, different amounts of credits, or maybe in this case, different periods that a single student has enrolled for. So when you're just trying to ask really big picture questions, like how many students enrolled for classes in spring 2020 versus spring 2019, you might not need a custom calendar for that, especially if you have a column like this, which already inserts the period into your data set, right? So to look at sort of a simple breakdown like that, you can see in this worksheet here, the title says, what was our total head count of enrollment in fall 2020 versus fall 2019? So like I said, probably no custom calendar needed here. I could just take, let's say, my academic period description here. Okay, and then I'm going to get dummy ID as kind of a placeholder for something like student ID. So I'm going to go ahead and just I'll show you a quick trick here I like to use with this. If I know I want a unique count of student IDs, what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and drag dummy ID to the columns shelf. And with the right click and drag instead of the left click and drag, instead of just dropping it on there like a normal dimension and showing you every single partition, what it does is it asks if you want to aggregate it. So, if I don't, I could still just pick this dummy ID. But since I just want a unique count, I would say, okay, distinct count dummy ID. Let me just throw a label at the end of these bars. And now, we're able to quickly answer that question at the top of the worksheet, right? So our unique enrollment number of students for fall 2019 was about 41,700, and for fall 2020, a bit of a drop off, right? So just north of the 40,000 figure. So as long as I'm just trying to do a high level comparison like that, this is fine, right? No customization needed. All right. Now, where this gets a little more challenging is if the question kind of goes another level deeper, right? So what if that question, instead of total enrollment at, just for this semester ever, let's say that it's not the start of the semester yet. Let's say it's 10 days before the start of fall 2020. So if the question asks, how does enrolled headcount 10 days before the start of fall semester 2020 compared to 2019, this is a very different question, right? So instead of just saying, oh yeah, total enrollment was 41,000 versus 40,000, I need to say, okay, I need to go to a point in time and figure out how these numbers would compare. So of course, one of the things that we need to be able to do to answer this question about 10 days before this period versus this period is we would need to know when that start date is, right? And this is something that's, I would say, fairly unique to an academic calendar, which is that start date is not a set date every year, right? Unlike a fiscal calendar where a fiscal year might start on January 1st or July 1st, and it's just, predictable. It's the same thing every time. A lot of times it's like, oh, it's the last Monday before Labor Day, or, something like that. So it could be August 23rd or August 27th. And so this is the kind of scenario where it can be so valuable to create a custom calendar to integrate with your work in Tableau. And I think that can sound really intimidating, like, oh, create a custom calendar, like where would I even start with that? And I would say that it doesn't have to be. It can actually be fairly simple. So let me show you kind of the most simple version of an academic calendar that, at least in my mind, that you could create that would still add a lot of value and help you answer a question like this. All right, so there's a screenshot of what I created. You can see it's, nothing too crazy. What I've got is, let's kind of walk through each of the different columns here. So I break it down by academic year, the name of the period, which you'll notice kind of syncs up with the period name from that enrollment data set, a period start date and a period end date, as well as a class start date and a class end date. So you may not need all 4 of those dates. It might just be that 2 of those does the trick for you. But sometimes that can be a little tricky of like the period technically starts on this day, but the classes don't start till 2 weeks later. But here's the beauty of this is that now comparing the 2 different fall semesters, I can easily see fall semester 2019 starts on August 26, 19. Fall semester 20 starts on August 24th, 20. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to integrate this with our enrollment data. Okay. So the way that we're going to do that is I'm going to flip back to this worksheet that was asking this question about this whole 10 days before the start of the semester. I'm going to go ahead and go back to my data source fake enrollment. I can just do that by double clicking on what's called fake enrollment up here at the top of my data pane. And that puts me here where I'm just seeing the fake enrollment CSV data. So now if I want to integrate that custom calendar, it's actually in a separate Excel file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select add up here by connections. And I'm going to add an Excel file. Okay. I'm going to pick the calendar that I've created here. And so right now, you can see I do have a secondary connection for this calendar data set. I've actually got a couple different calendars in here. Right now, we're just focusing on the academic variety. And so what I want to do is I'm just going to take my academic calendar and I'm going to drag and drop this next to fake enrollment. And I just want to point out something here because I've actually already made a selection earlier that allows me to just go straight to a join. What I mean by that is I can just drop academic calendar here after fake enrollment, get my little Venn diagram and pick, this period should equal that period, and I'm off to the races. However, with newer versions of Tableau, like newer meaning probably like anything 2020.1 and later, Tableau is going to give you a relationship rather than a join by default, which means if I was to get this calendar, I get this, you've probably seen this like orange noodly squiggly thing. We don't have time probably to get into all the nuances of relationships versus joins today, but I will say my personal preference is to generally do a join unless there are select circumstances that make a relationship more practical, like if it's a performance consideration. But if I don't want the squigglies and I don't want the relationship, I want to really be able to define exactly how I want these fields to relate. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the drop down next to fake enrollment and say, actually usually I double click it. So here's what I'll do. I'll just double click where it says fake enrollment.csv. You can see it gives me a little thing. Hey, do you want to go from the physical to the logical table? What's going on? Worry about that. You double click on it. What I was looking for is just this little ribbon right here. So this little blue ribbon indicates that this came from this data source. Now that I'm here, get my academic calendar, drag and drop. And this is actually made fairly simple because I just need to set the period names equal to each other. So academic period description in one data source is equal to period name in the other data source. And you can see that a bunch of kind of representative data just filled out down below. Now, this isn't directly applicable to this situation, but I just want to bring something up here, which is in another example later, we'll set one date equal to another date, and that's another great thing. What I think I'm also going to do, and I'm actually just going to make a note for myself right now, is just send you a follow-up resource which talks about another way of joining calendar data to regular data, which is enrollment is a tricky situation for joining against dates in a calendar rather than period names like this. And the reason that I say that is with enrollment, I mean, you could enroll one day before a semester starts or, months before a semester starts. So I can't just say, well, if somebody enrolled in April of 2020, they were enrolling for fall semester. They could have been enrolling for the summer term or for the spring term. So it's much cleaner just to join on period name, but there are sort of different and interesting situations where maybe you want to join on dates, or say my date of interest needs to fall after this start date, but before this end date. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on that now. That is something that we could look at later if that's of interest. So I'm just going to leave that there. But this should work as is, as long as we have all of the semesters in our academic calendar. This join should work great as is. So just to go back to our worksheet, how does enrolled headcount compare, all of this, right? So again, we could just do something where we said, okay, well, give me my period name and, you know, my total count of student IDs. And that's fine. That still works great. But again, our big question was, how does enrolled headcount 10 days before the start of fall semester 2020 compare to 2019? So the next thing that we need to do is we need to find the day that somebody registered and figure out how many days before or after a class start date that their enrollment date was. So just to help clear the air on that, going back to our little screenshot here. So say 8/26/2019. So if somebody enrolled on 8/24/2019, they would only have been 2 days before the start date, right? Whereas if I enrolled on 7/26/2019, then I would have been, I think July has 31 days. So I think I'd be at 31 days before the start of classes. So here's how we'll handle that. I'm going to create a calculated field, and I'll call this days before semester start. And it will look like this. I'm going to use what's called the date diff function. So I'll say, give me the date diff in days, and I'm saying days because saying the word just day sounds weird, but it's just the safest bet here is just to do singular, all lowercase in single quotations, and you won't have any problems. So give me the date difference in days between the enrollment date and the class start date. All right. So this should figure out, okay, did they enroll 5 days before the start of the semester? Did they enroll 1 day after the start of the semester? You know, how far off was this? So I'm gonna hit okay. And I'm actually just gonna show you the underlying data right now. I'm hoping that that calculation will show up as a column just so I can show you like what a few of these records actually end up looking like. Okay, so I can see here, this person's enrollment date was April 9th, 2019 for 2019 fall semester, and the actual class start date is August 26th, 2019. So that's actually borderline. Oh, that's over 4 months. So that should be 130 or 40 something days, I think. And then, yeah, perfect. So then you can see over here on that almost far right column, days before semester start is 139. So that sounds about right to me. I'm not going to get down to the nitty gritty of like, you know, iPhone calculating this, but that's right about where that should be. So then what I can do now to answer this question, how does enrolled headcount 10 days before the start of fall 2020 compared to fall 2019? First of all, I guess I could just keep this, just to make this simple, I'm going to add a copy of my period field to filters and just do a wildcard match on the term fall. So I'm not seeing those spring semesters because that's just kind of unnecessary noise for us right now. Okay, just showed it, so if somebody did want to flip to spring, they could. And then again, so 10 days before the start. So what I would do here is I'm going to create another calculated field, and I'm going to say that our new calculation days before semester start, I'm going to say this must be greater than or equal to the number 10. So if it was 11 days before the semester start, fine. If it was 100, fine. If it was 6, not okay. That's not going to cut it. So I'm just going to call this my days before semester start filter. And I'll drop this on the filters card and just keep those values that are true. And hit OK. And I see that those numbers, they do drop off a bit, right? So whereas before it was like 41,000 versus 40,000, now we're down to like 38,000 versus somewhere in the 36,000 range. So to test if this is working, or does it make sense, something that we could always do is just kind of tinker with this parameter just to see. So like, okay, if I narrow the field down to it has to be greater than or equal to 3 days, does the enrollment figure jump up? I would assume that it would. And you can see that it did. Okay, so one other sort of interesting addition that you could do to a situation like this is to allow your end user some more flexibility. Like if they want to be able to select 10 days, 20 days, 3 days, like if you want to give them that power, you could do that with a parameter, right? So instead of a designer like us having to go into this calculation and always be changing this reference number, we could give them a parameter. So here's what that would look like. I'll create a parameter, and I'll call this days before semester start. My data type will be an integer, right? Whole numbers. I'm not looking for half days, just whole days. And I think instead of giving a list, like a drop down they could pick from, or a range where they could move a slider, I'm just going to pick all. If you want to restrict what numbers they could pick, right? If you want to say, well, it's got to be between 1 and 10, you can do that with range. But I'll just do all and have it be defaulted to 10. So let me go ahead and show this parameter. You can see it down here at the bottom of my data pane in the bottom left corner of my screen. So I'll show my parameter. I'm going to edit that filter field, swap out the number 10 for the parameter that we just created. That wasn't quite as smooth as I was hoping, but that happens. Okay, so because it's set to 10 right now, nothing changes. But if I change this reference point, so let's say like 30, those numbers will change, right? So, okay, there was 34,000 students registered 30 days before the start of the semester. What about 90? How many people have registered 90 days or more, right? So now we're down to about half the students that we had before. So I think something like this could be a powerful tool. One other quick thing that I'll do here is I'm going to change the title. So instead of just statically saying 10 days, I can insert the parameter value, I should say. So where it says parameters, days before semester start, I click on that. And now as I change this number here, it will actually change the value listed here in the title as well. Cool. So let me kind of just open the floor here for a moment, just because that's sort of close to the natural endpoint of what I've kind of preconceived for the discussion around an academic calendar. So before moving into fiscal calendars, which will shift the conversation a little bit, just want to open the floor. You're welcome to use, probably the easiest thing is if you want to type something into that questions dialog, then I can kind of handle it one by one so it doesn't end up becoming too chaotic. So I'll just kind of open the floor here for 20 seconds, let you type anything in if there's any immediate questions on that. And if not, we can move on to the next section. Cool. So I am seeing a few things. So some of these I think I can address now. And then some of these maybe I will save toward the end of the day. So I did see a question about calculating date difference. Only wouldn't include like weekends or holidays. I will provide some follow-up on that I've got a couple different kind of blog posts and videos that I've done. So I'm gonna just make a note to myself that that'll be part of the follow-up. And if we have time at the end of today as well, we can talk about that. But some of those resources will probably do a better job than I can. Thank you for the shout out about the parameter in the title. Glad to know that that's helpful. Let's see. So creating the academic calendar table, I actually just typed this into a spreadsheet in Excel, right? So you can just see that I just kind of pieced it out. I just Googled the calendars online and just kind of found the start dates and end dates. And so that wasn't too crazy. I spent more time on it than I probably should have, trying to include lots of past years and things like that. And just realized that, we, at least in our examples today, we weren't going to be going back to like the academic year 2012. So didn't necessarily need to do that. But yeah, basically you just need to find the information somewhere where you can get the start and end dates, and then you can just piece it out. I guess I should also say this. I would also ask around your organization as well, because it may be that there's a database somewhere that has these tables already so that you don't necessarily have to build them from scratch. Yeah, I see a couple others. Yeah, so I think this is similar about kind of creating that a calendar table. So again, I'm just using Excel for the sake of example here, but unless there's a reason that you need to formalize it and like put it in your database, I guess I would say that could be a really cool and helpful idea for other users, right? If there's going to be 20 other people in your organization that could use access to the academic calendar, then maybe coming up with a centralized place to store this information where everybody could access it could be helpful. I mean, you could even do something like a Google Sheet, right? Where, there's a Google Sheet that's shared with others, then anybody can access it. And you can also restrict who has access to be able to just view the sheet versus who can edit it. So again, in kind of a little bit of a knockoff fashion, something like that might work as well. Yeah, and I got another question about what the level of difficulty is for connecting Excel to Tableau server. So that probably depends a little bit. I think I know what I think I kind of know where that question's going though, which is for the process of connecting the calendar here to our original enrollment data, I utilized what's called cross-database joins, which just allows you to add secondary connections and just join them like they're part of the same data source. Now, Tableau server, as well as a few other data sources, are a little bit more restricted, or I guess you can see like a JSON file can't necessarily be added as a secondary data source. So sometimes you'll end up with those kinds of, I guess, limitations, and then you have to turn to a different process for combining those tables of data. So something like data blending might be the route that you would need to go. So what I'm going to do is jot down a note to myself to include some follow-up about data blending in case you have that kind of situation, like adding Excel as a secondary connection isn't just a default option because of the types of data that you're using. Yeah, good question. Okay, cool. So it seems like that's kind of it for now. If I miss anything, feel free to put it in there again, and I can address that in due course. So yeah, hopefully that was kind of an interesting dive into one example for how you could use an academic calendar. So I know that fiscal calendars, right? That's applicable a lot of times in educational settings, right? So most educational institutions will be on something closer to a federal fiscal calendar, which would start on July 1st. But that's also widely applicable to a number of organizations that may not necessarily be government entities, right? There's plenty of private industry which don't start on January 1st as well. So I do want to take a moment for us to be able to go into, fiscal calendars as well. All right. So we're going to be looking at some data which on the surface looks similar to that enrollment data, but a little bit different. So in this case, didn't mean to zoom in there. In this case, similar start, right? We have like our student IDs and what period that they enrolled and all that. But the difference here is that what we're tracking is their payment date and their payment amount. So if we want to say something like, how did how have payments tracked, this semester, 30 days into this semester compared to 30 days of the same semester last year, then we would have the flexibility to do that. So again, similar to the enrollment data, if I'm just asking like, what was the total payments received this year versus last year, there's not like a ton that's maybe, I should say, specialized within that question based on the way our data is set up. So what I could do is I could just take my like periods, right? Put that on rows, and just take our, oops, I'm in the wrong data set. One moment. So I'm gonna take my period, put that on rows. I don't think I have an academic year, so I might create a quick group here actually. Let me do a calculated field. I'm just gonna ask for the leftmost 4 characters of my period description. Let's call this year in quotes. Although this is probably academic year, so this is probably a horrible way to do this, but whatever. So I'm gonna hit OK. So I could kind of approximate year using academic year, although an academic year isn't always the same as a fiscal year. So there's actually probably a number of reasons this isn't the best way to do this. But what I could do is say something like, okay, what was our amount brought in, this year versus last year, that kind of thing. So I could see like, okay, last year we're looking at 527 million versus 508 million. So there's definitely a gap there, right? So what if the question gets more nuanced, right? So kind of similar to what we looked at in that last section, you can see here the question at the top of this worksheet says, how does tuition payments received by the 180th day of FY21 compare to FY20? Okay, so I know some of you were at that webinar we did a few months ago where we were talking about date calculations. And one of those is we looked at this ability to use a function called date part, and you could ask for the day of year of a date. So for instance, like today, June 24th, for a standard calendar, today's date would actually be, let me think about this for a second. I think it actually would be pretty close to the 180th day of the year, right? Because there's roughly 30 days a month, and we're almost at the end of month 6. So I'm just going to airball this. Let's just call this the 176th day of the year, right? So there's a calculation which could quickly tell you that. Now, I did some testing in preparation for this webinar to find out, could Tableau's day of year function figure out what day of the year today was if we said that the fiscal year started on July 1st, right? So if we said, so imagine right now is the end of FY22, this would almost be the last day of FY22, right? Or whatever you want to say that, maybe it is, whatever fiscal year it is, right? We're like 6 days from the very end of the year. So it'd be like 359. So I did a little testing on this. I just used some Superstore data. And let me look at what I've got here. So first of all, I've got a date field where I use Tableau's default to set the fiscal year start to July 1st. Let me go ahead and zoom in on that. So again, I'm using date. I went to the default properties, fiscal year start, and said July. So using this kind of default fiscal year start change is great for just kind of quick comparisons. Like, hey, what was the total number of students in FY20 versus FY21? Yeah, no problem. Like I said, where this starts to break down is if you're trying to do more like running comparisons, like, okay, well, in this day this year versus this same day last year, how did our payments or how did our enrollments compare? So what I saw here, again, today's dates of June 24th, 21 should be like the very end of FY21. So let me check this out here. So right now, so here's what's weird. Right now, it already says a 366th day of FY21. And let's go ahead and just look at what that is, just to see what Tableau thinks. So it's saying, you can see here, right? Myth busted. Tableau is saying that December 31st, 2020 is the end of FY21. Like, it doesn't make any sense. That's the last day of the calendar year 2020, not the last day of the fiscal year of 2021. So you can see this isn't really working the way that we probably would have hoped, right? So this is where we got to take matters into our own hands. So again, back to this question: how does tuition payments recede by the 180th day of FY21 compared to FY20? So one of the big things we would need to do is to create our own custom calendar. So this is just a simple calendar that I created in Excel. This is a screenshot. I'll show you this in Excel in a moment. So you can see that what I've done is I've just got 3 columns. So the first is a date. The second tells you what fiscal year that date is a part of. And then the third column just tells you what day of the fiscal year that day is. So July 1st, 2018 is the first day of fiscal year 19. Okay. So to show you this now in its more kind of full-on fashion, right, it ends up looking like this. So the last day in my data set right now is 6/30/2021, which is the 365th day of FY21. You can see that I just did a few fiscal years for the sake of this example. And let me see if I can get back to the top. There you go. So starts 7/1/18, ends 6/30/21. You can kind of keep creating this if you want. I mean, so this wasn't too crazy. I basically just did that thing where you go, okay, like 7/1/18. And then if you start to just grab the bottom and drag that down, Tableau will continue to fill in successive dates. So 7/2, 7/3. And then, you know, I started doing something like this where I would say, okay, this is the first day of the year. This is the second day of the year. And I think it does need to be like this. Once you've got the 1 and the 2, you can select those and start dragging it down, and it continues to create those successive numbers, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. So this maybe took like 10 minutes to create this whole thing. Yeah, I mean, so you could kind of take this and customize it the way you want. Now, there was a question earlier about business days, right? So in this case, I'm not really distinguishing between a weekend or a weekday or holidays. But you can use a similar method to this to create like a business calendar. I actually just did a video posted on our YouTube channel a couple weeks ago on that. So I will link to that in some follow-up content that I send. But basically what I would do is I would have Excel evaluate each date. And if it's a weekday, it'll give me a 1. And if it's a weekend, it will give me a 0. And then I just ask Tableau to do like a running sum of these. So it'd be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that's how I've approached that kind of issue in the past. Okay, so we have our calendar, and we have our enrollment, or actually it's our payment data, wherever that is. There it is. So now what I need to do is to link a payment date to that calendar I just showed you so that it could tell us, oh, well, this is the 90th day of the year or the 274th or whatever it would be. Okay, so let me go back to my fake tuition payment data source. And a similar setup. Oh, look, it's trying to do the relationship thing. So I got to double click here. Now more in the join dialog. I'm going to add my connection. Once again, Excel. I've actually got both calendars in the same Excel workbook, so I got to go in there again. And now I'm going to get the fiscal calendar. And there's an interesting wrinkle that I realized, which I probably could have gotten rid of, but I wanted to leave it. Just, it's one of those gotchas that you may not even realize what it is in the moment. So if I just tell Tableau, okay, yeah, link the calendar to the payment data on final payment date equals date, Tableau actually gives me an error. You can see that it's not working. And if I hover over that, it's a little technical, but it's basically saying these two date fields that I'm trying to link on are not the same type. One of them is just a date field, right? 6/24 2021. One of them is date and time. So it'd be like 6/24 2021, 9/43/07, whatever. So Tableau will not allow you to join on columns that are different data types. So one solution for this is I'm going to convert my final payment date, which has a timestamp and is technically a date time field. I'm just going to convert that to just a standard date field. So I'll hit this drop down, say create join calculation, and I'll just wrap this final payment date field in the date function. Okay, this is essentially a type conversion function. You can see a little explanation here. It says returns a date given a number, string, or date expression. You can see the example there is that it shows a full-on date and then it just returns year, month, day. I should say it has the original value that it's converting has a timestamp. So once I do that, Tableau is happy with us, which is nice. And you can see our summary data down below. So what I can do then is I'm going to flip back to this. How does tuition payments received by the 180th day of FY21 compared to FY20? So a few things. I'm going to get, let's see, fiscal day of year, right? That's what goes 1 through 365. Tableau just doesn't realize that that's not really a measure, right? So measures, right, this bottom section of our data pane, those are generally numeric values that you're trying to analyze, add, subtract, multiply, divide, whereas dimensions is used for categorization. So typically speaking, a date is going to fall as a dimension because you're using it to segment data into months or weeks or days. You're not trying to add the first, second, and third day together to say that the output is 6. Like, just doesn't really make sense. So I'm just going to take fiscal day of year and just drag and drop it into the dimensions section of the data pane. I'm going to drag that fiscal day of year field to the column shelf. So it should start with 1 and end at 366 because of years that have leap days. I'm going to put amount on rows. Right, that's the tuition payment amounts. I'm going to put fiscal year, which came from that calendar of ours. I'm going to put that on color. I'm going to change my mark type to line. I'm going to set my fit from standard to entire view so I can see this all in one screen. And so right now, this is just showing us the actual number per day. So I can see, like, if I'm thinking of this right, like the highest amount of tuition payments ever paid in a day was 3.7 million. However, what might be more interesting would be to see a running sum to see how the total of a year compared to the total of another year. So I'm going to go to the sum amount that's on my row shelf, hit the drop down, add a table calculation, and I'm going to ask for a running total on table across. And I think that's fine the way it is. So you can see that I'm generally working with sort of a little bit of partial data, meaning like, this is made up data, so that's why there's weird gaps. But I didn't have data from early FY19, FY21 kind of peters out. So again, the question was, how does tuition payments received by the 180th day of FY21 compared to FY20? So now what I'm going to do, similar to that earlier example, I'm going to create a calculated field. I'll call this, fiscal year FY day of year filter. So I will say that where's that field? Fiscal day of year must be greater than or equal to 180. Actually, nope, flip that. Less than or equal to 180. So this would be the effectively I'm gonna just kind of the rough cut, but it would be like July 1st, the first day of the fiscal year, through the 180th, which would be like what, July, August, September, October, November, December. So close to, if not through the end of December. So I'll drop that on filters. Say keep true, keep only the values that meet that criteria. I may just want to exclude FY 2019 since that's not part of what we're trying to compare. And then here, if I want to, I could add labels to these lines. It's probably going to look crazy at first. It's going to add labels to like every day that it could, but I could just ask for labels on my line ends and maybe just the end of the line. So I could see that FY20, we by the 180th day of am I saying this right? Yeah. So FY20, by the 180th day of that fiscal year, we had brought in 208 million in payments. But at that same comparison day, FY21, that number was only at 143 million. And you can sort of see the curvature of the lines, right? FY21 kind of started faster and then plateaued, whereas FY20 actually shot up at the same period where FY21 plateaued. Right, so this is kind of the analysis the Tableau is built for, and then from here you're diving into, well, why did that happen? Like, how were we able to get people on better payment plans last year than this year, or what circumstances came into this? And then almost exactly the same again as our earlier example. If you want to give your user that flexibility, you could say like FY day of years to include up to. This is horrible languaging. But again, I could do like an integer where my user could pick between 1 to 366. And I don't know if a slider is actually the best idea here, but this way, once again, I could I'll edit this, get rid of the 180, put my parameter in there instead. And then if my user wants to pick something else, like, well, what did this look like at 90 days? What did FY21 have the lead then? And kind of see across different periods how those 2 years compared to one another. Okay, so yeah, let me just flip back one more time to what that fiscal calendar looked like, and then I think I'll be opening up the floor again. So I do see a couple questions that have come up in the meantime. Let me go ahead and check those out and address those. And feel free just to keep firing questions. I'll just try to be working my way from top to bottom. So if more questions come up while I am working through them, that's great. Kind of just hit them one at a time. Okay, cool. So I think one of those about creating the calendar was from the last session. Okay, just saw a comment about a company having 53 fiscal weeks every 4 years. Yeah, so that's one of those situations where, in that case, maybe what you'd want to do is, as part of your custom calendar, to include a column which is called week number, right? Because there's a lot of industries which will have something custom. Like I know I've worked with a lot of restaurant chains where instead of 12 months, what they try to do is to compare what they call periods. They'll have 13 28-day periods throughout the year. So say have this period due compared to last period. In all of those kinds of custom circumstances, generally a custom calendar is needed. So that might look like something you create in Excel. For something like a much larger restaurant chain, I know a lot of times like they would actually have a custom calendar as part of their data set already that you could utilize. But yeah, if you have specific questions around a use case you're working on or an analysis you're trying to do, but just not sure how to properly set up the table, feel free to email me and I'm happy to kind of share my thoughts or resources that I've made or know of that could help with that. Yeah, so got another good question. So about whether we could break the calendar down by week or month. So kind of similar, I think, right? So yeah, I used day of year as kind of our example, like how did the 180 days of this year compare to last year? But right, if your user wanted to say by by March, how did these compare? Or by March 25th or something like that. You could totally do that. Now, the calculations may look a little bit different, but I think that otherwise it would roughly work the same. So I'm thinking a couple things on that front. First, you may want additional columns if you're going to be breaking it down like that. So like what I might do is I might create something called month number, right? So month number would just be 1 through 12. So July 2018 would be month 1. August 2018 would be month 2. And that way I could still set up logic, which would say like, okay, if somebody says March, what they really mean is month 9. So everything from the 9th month and earlier would get kept. Similar idea for weeks, right? So if you wanted to include like what weekday, or not weekday, but what week number of the year is this, you could have a week column. And back to the example that I built here, right? So what I did for this example was say, okay, 158th day of the year, how did they compare? But if I wanted to pick a specific date, I mean, I think that's a fairly, I think that's a reasonable ask and something that people would often want to be able to do. So if I'm going to say, how does tuition payments received by the 180th day? So I'm going to change this a little bit, and I'm going to say, how does tuition received by 12/31 in FY21 compare to FY20, right? So what if my user wants to be able to pick a date like December 31st rather than have to say 180, because then they don't have to do that mental math. So I'm going to do a couple things here. I'm going to create a parameter, which will have a date. And again, I'll have this one default to 12/31/2020. I do have to think about that. I have not planned this out yet, so we'll see how smoothly this goes. So I'm going to show this, and let me remove this, and let me think about this for a second. So don't want that. So I think what I would do is I got to figure out what, I think I got it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a calculated field, and I will call this reference date day of year. So the way this has worked is I'll say if the date from the calendar equals the reference date in my parameter, then give me my fiscal day of year. So what this would figure out is it would say, okay, 12/31/2020. I don't know this for sure, but that's roughly the 180th day of the year. So this would return the number 180. Do some funky stuff here, so bear with me. I don't have too long to explain it, but what this would do is it would only on that one row where it found 12/31/2020 would it tell me 180, and I need an entire column in my data set which says 180. So I'm going to do a little trick with a fixed level of detail expression to say opening curly brace. So give me the maximum, whatever the maximum output of this calculation is, which should be roughly 180. Give me the maximum of that and fix that across the entire data source. So now instead of seeing 180 just related to one row of data, it's going to say 180 for every row of data. Okay, so let me go ahead and duplicate this calculation here. FYDOY filter. So this would become FY reference date filter. So if this works, I'm going to go ahead and put my reference day of year in here. Hit OK. Put this on filters. Now the one risk is if there was no payment on that date, 12/31/2020, it wouldn't show up. So I might want to change my join to be a right join to keep every day from that calendar, even if there were no payments on that day. So now if I switch this to different days of the year, it'll say, okay, well, if I keep through 12/31/2020, how does that compare to if I kept through that same day of that previous year? And then we'll compare those two. So like I said, as probably sort of a safety measure, what I would do in the join is I would switch this from an inner to a right join, because like who's paying their tuition on New Year's Eve? I don't know, maybe nobody. So that could end up causing an issue if I had just left that as an inner join. Yeah, so probably have time for like one more question, and then anything else I might end up saying, we can stay late for that. Oh, okay, yeah. So this will be the last question I'll cover, which will be about how to get Tableau to put your terms in the order that you want, so it doesn't put like, let's say, fall, spring, summer, whatever it would be. If you ever want to change the default order that Tableau shows your terms, what you can do is you can go to like your period or term name field, go to default properties and sort, and then you can have them sort in whatever order you want. So I guess it's still pulling this up here. So rather than the data source order, I'm going to select manual. So I think I've actually gotten fortunate here because I've got year and then term name. It actually does put it in order: 2019 fall, 2019 spring. But you could imagine if these were flipped, right? If it was fall 2019, fall 2020, whatever, then it would put it in all your falls first and then all your springs. So you can actually just manually rearrange these values, and that will then be your default sort order. Cool. So I'll do my little close here, and then if there's any kind of additional questions past the hour, then I can stick around for a couple extra minutes. So thanks so much for being here. I know some of you are probably watching on the recording as well. So I do have some resources. When I do a blog post with this, I'll link those on the bottom, or if you're seeing this on YouTube, I'll put them there as well. Some things, if you want to be in touch, we do content like this all the time. So we've got a blog, we've got a YouTube channel. If you want to work together on a project, you're welcome just to email me. I'm not going to like charge you to answer a quick question or like send you a resource. I'm always happy to do that. But if you do want to work together on a bigger project, there are ways of doing that as minimal of a commitment as 1 hour at a time, or scaling out to more hours or days or weeks or months. So you're welcome to reach out to me. I've also put a link there to just my standing office hours. And we have some classes. So the next classes of our own that we're doing is I think actually kicking off in early August. So we'll be doing a little bit more project focused in July, and then over to some more classes in August. So I'll also put a link for where you can find those. And you can always reach me at my email address, which is just eric.parker@onenumber.biz. That's B-I-Z. So thank you for being here. I really appreciate you sticking out for an hour. I know it's a long time. Hopefully you were able to get a couple of helpful ideas out of this that can help you on your own Tableau journey. And if I can do anything for you, just let me know. Otherwise, have a great Thursday, and I'll talk to you soon.